calling now Massimo Tavoni. We're going to get into a discussion on how science can actually help us understand what's happening and also communicate what's happening to different type of audiences. So Massimo Tavoni is one of the authors of the IPCC reports, the 5th and 6th. So it's very important to have him here today to understand exactly not only how these reports are drafted and organized, but mainly how we can actually make the best use of them to understand what's happening in the future scenario. It's from the Resources for the Future, CMCC, European Institute on Economics and the Environment, and the director as well of the EIEE. Massimo, welcome. See, yeah, you can sit there. Let me just get. Okay, so my first question for Massimo Tavoni is really to help us understand what is a climate scenario. We've been discussing very often about the scenario. The report gives us the scenarios. Many scientific papers are based on scenarios. How do we understand what it means to draft and look in a future scenario?
So thanks, Elisabetta, and welcome everyone. I think this is indeed science and science of science, in the sense that it brings together different groups trying to use a common language, and the common language is that of scenarios. So IPCC has 3 working groups. Have you seen the first working group released its latest report last summer in the 6th assessment report. Second and third working group will come out mid next year. And the language that they use between themselves is that of scenarios. Scenarios are imaginations of futures, and their consequences, mostly in terms of climate change, but also in terms of consequences for society, for health, for well-being, for energy, for technologies, for a lot of things.
So how difficult, I know this is a very silly question, but that's what we very often ask from the outside of the science world, how difficult it is to actually draft a scenario or draw a scenario, especially when we're looking long-term in the future.
Yeah, obviously we are looking very long-term, so it's not that someone tomorrow is going to check the weather forecast and whether they're good or not, and you're going to be criticized. Luckily, that's not happening, so we're going to be criticized every 7 years or so, but we have to look at least for this century, and that is a challenge. Now, how we do it, we are scientists, so we're very boring. We use data and a very empirical approach. So we use data to try to think about futures because we have been trained to work on data, on numbers, on models. And we use those to make projections for the future. And we recognize that if you use the past data, we can only imagine certain futures. But what we are actually looking at is the future which is very different from the past. And so that is where things becomes much more complicated. How can we imagine futures which are different from the past if the only data that we have are the data from the past?
Somehow you need, I mean, I'm pretty sure it's all strongly data-based, but also you need somehow a portion of imagination.
Yeah, exactly, because the data can bring you forward only by looking at the past, and that's something we don't want to do. So how do we do it? We do it some way. I think we need help, and this community can help. Let me tell you how we do it. We look at data, we look at histories of things which have happened historically, which could be useful in understanding possible futures. Obviously, there are some in the past that will come back and can be used to understand a different future. We ask people to think about the future. So we ask experts, what is your opinion about the future? Sometimes they get it right, often they get it wrong. Ultimately, we are not exactly and only looking about something which is necessarily right in the sense of doing a right projection, because we cannot forecast 100 years. What we are interested in is thinking what would be the consequences of certain futures. And then we imagine many different futures, and for each of these different futures we say, okay, what will be the challenges, what will be the consequences?
So from your point of view as a scientist, what do people can take out of these scenarios? How can they translate a scenario in something practical or giving also indication for policies, but also for future developments at local community level?
I think now, I mean, these scenarios are used, we generate them, then a lot of people take them, do a lot of incredible things, including turning those scenarios in something that people can understand, not just scientists. So then, CMCC just released the scenarios for the future temperatures in certain cities in the country. What will be the weather in Milan or the climate in Milan down the road. This is something people can relate to very well when you discuss things that people understand and relate every day. There are many ways to visualize and help people understand this complex information. And people working in art, design, and data visualization, not just scientists necessarily, but also more on the visualization side, have helped make tremendous use of scenarios, which are now used everywhere.
Yeah, we will have a lot of possibility to taste different ways of using this data in this afternoon. But Massimo Tavoni, there is also the point of how much these scenarios have become, I don't want to say common in discussion outside of the science world, but anyway, how did you see along the last few years the scene of climate communication changing? Have you seen awareness raising or not, and how people are reacting now compared to a few years ago?
I think the awareness has raised, that's pretty clear from everything that we hear today, the participation of the institutions, the people in the streets of the Fridays for the Future, including tomorrow's Friday. So I think that has changed a lot, and that obviously has changed, especially among the young people, who are also the quickest to understand even complex information because they are used to that. So that has changed a lot, and it's changed as our job as well to try to perceive futures. I always say, we are depicting bad futures to, in a way, also make people understand about the consequences of the climate crisis if we do not work on it. What we should also do, and that's more difficult, at least I can see that from a science communication perspective. What is more difficult is how to make people think about a good future. So what would be the Earth in 20, 30 years from now when it's going to be clean? Hopefully it's going to be clean. If you think about that future and you try to think about yourself in that future, it's going to become very natural to think that you don't want to go back to now. And in that way, it's much easier for us also to get the message across, and also I think for policymakers to decide on ambitious policies.
Yeah, in a way, I think it's also interesting to see how scientists have been trying to communicate this data and all the research done for at least 30 years now, maybe even a little bit more about what's happening. And the fact that the target audience that is actually listening more are the younger people and the people who actually started reacting. Did that provide for you an interesting new group of people to relate to, or are there connection between the science and community and all of these younger, let's say, and active players in the field of the fight to climate crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a professor at the university, so I teach, I'm a teacher. And in that role, I think that's where I saw the most changing. And I also see the most interesting things happening. So the students are coming up and are asking for thesis, for work, what can we do, what job opportunities, can I do research, if it's not research, what shall I do? And I can tell you, universities sometimes are a bit conservative places by the way they are designed. And in a way, it has been the demand of the students to know more about these topics, which has pushed and forced the universities to actually open up more research topics and more teaching activities on climate change. And it's still not there in many Italian universities. It's still lacking quite a lot. And this has changed a lot. And I think this is most very important news, obviously, because these are the young students who are graduating these days, and obviously will be the ones which are going to decide for the future as well, hopefully.
And on this, maybe, it's a very strange question to pose to a scientist, but how important it is art or literature, music, other forms of communication? Again, I always like to quote the Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh saying, we haven't looked enough, and Ghosh has been saying for many years now that literature should focus more, for example, on the big story of climate change and make it a protagonist of a lot of the work that's been done in the creative process. So how important it is from your point of view, the fact that, for example, this becomes a theme discussed in books, in arts, and everywhere else?
I mean, this is very important, just because, as I said before, we need that as well. Otherwise, we keep thinking like that. I was looking at that thing. We keep thinking and going in circles because that's our approach. I mean, an artist can come, or a fiction writer can come and just move you along those lines and just put you in a completely different world very easily through a narrative. That's what writers are good at and artists are good at, in essentially putting yourself outside your thinking and box. And I think that's where we really need help. And in the past, I mean, the fiction, obviously science fiction has a long tradition, even longer than, actually much longer than climate science. And so futures very different from today's have been imagined for a long time. Now, to make them successful, the fiction writers have typically used the two extremes, either very dystopian futures, very bad, very unequal, or very utopian futures. And I think for us, what we need is also something in between. Maybe it's not going to sell a lot of books, but it's something that is going to help us tremendously in trying to show that the road to a climate neutral society, a climate safe society, is going to be bumpy, but it's going to bring us definitely towards a much better place. And I think that's also for us, in search of creativity and input, that's where we might actually profit the most and get out of with better scenarios, more interesting, more fun, more engaging as well.
So that's my last question, Massimo Tavoni. Do you see the scientific community getting more into this? I mean, I'm pretty sure that for many years it was very much, the communication was based on data and scientific facts. And as a journalist, I got this experience a lot, that we were trying to translate the documents and make sure that, for example, our newspapers or radio or whatever would buy this possibility of discussing this and trying to find a way to make it usable or interesting, appealing for the people. Do you think it's also useful for the scientific community, the fact of having different ways of telling the story?
So this is a double-edged sword. Yeah. Finally, the journals want to hear what we have to say. So let's talk to them. And let's talk to them as much as we can and communicate as much as you can, social media, newspapers, and so forth. On the other hand, we are scientists first and foremost. So integrity is what we should strive for. And it's this thin balance between our private lives as citizens, participating maybe actively in civil society causes on climate change, or maybe not, and as a scientist who are trying to do work which is supposed to be as robust and impartial as neutral as possible. And so we have to find that balance, and it's not easy to find. I would say the scientific community has been quite good in moving towards being able to communicate more fully what they had to say, not being afraid of doing so, as was in the past because of the uncertainties. We also always think also, that we are, I mean, most scientists have imposter syndromes. They think that they do not deserve to be there because they are not good enough. That's what is typical characteristics. So that is being moved a little bit, and now a lot of scientists are very, they speak very openly about it. It's just that we have to be careful not crossing too many lines at some point. That's also my word of concern at the end.
Okay, so it's a challenge in the challenge, basically. Okay, thank you, Massimo Tavoni. Thank you for helping us understanding also from the point of view of someone who's working in the scientific community and field and realm, how do we try to mix, but also in a proper way, get the scientific information out in different ways. So thank you again for being with us.
Elizabeth, and thanks to everyone listening. Thank you.